So good morning, everyone, and welcome back for those of you who were here yesterday. And I'm glad that Houston could produce a nice sunny day. Hopefully it won't get to be too hot a day. Might have to dust off that old adage of if you don't like the weather in Texas, just stick around for a day and it certainly will change. So welcome back. One of the terms that Brett didn't use in introducing me was co-conspirator. And I might offer eager co-conspirator in terms of focusing on this Houston Low Carbon Summit agenda from two respects. In my role as KPMG Energy Strategy Leader, my current client work includes a couple of projects for major oil companies who are working on reducing their emissions footprint. But then with my center hat on, we've done some work that I'm going to draw on some extracts of around the Houston economy and where we stand after the recent oil and gas downturn, where things are headed in terms of various outlooks, lower for longer, lower forever, et cetera, and what that represents in terms of opportunities and perhaps imperatives to further diversify the Houston economy and create, in particular, more segments of high multiplier jobs. So we'll touch briefly on all jobs not being created equal and what types of opportunities might come out of the energy transition that could be additive to the Houston economy. So the overall objective of this upfront session, before we get into depth around company visions, transformation models, innovation, et cetera, is to put a Houston lens on this question of decarbonization. And some of my further commitment and passion to this topic comes out of the fact that having participated in a couple of recent European forums, quite candidly, references to Houston or the oil and gas industry were very limited. I would say almost none. And so at a minimum, I think there's a opportunity to better tell our story. And I think beyond that, perhaps engage in a dialogue and see what might be additive to the things that the industry in Houston is doing, which I think is quite considerable. I'm fortunate to be able to team up with Randy Bell with the General Atlantic Council, who has a similar mission to the center in terms of looking ahead at issues that are critical to the future of prosperity and safety around the globe, and Randy in particular runs the energy program at the Atlantic Council and have done similar work on the implications of what's going on in energy and economic implications of that and what it might mean for Houston. And did you want to add anything to that, Randy?
No, that's great.
Okay, we better jump in.
Yeah.
So I just got 5 extracts from the work that I referenced that touch on the vitality of the Houston economy. So we looked at, and the good news is, if you look back over time, the Houston economy has been a great success story as judged by relative growth versus the overall U.S. economy and a number of peer cities that the center tracks, Los Angeles, Atlanta, Dallas among them, cities with similar demographic size, land area, et cetera. I picked a statistic here, although you could pick any number of statistics, GDP per capita. This is net income per capita, which is a Bureau of Labor Statistics calculated number that subtracts average housing costs and tax from average income, and that magnifies the Houston advantage because of the affordability of the Houston area. But even in the down dips, you can see that the Houston economy has outperformed the U.S. economy. And again, if I plotted the peer cities, you'd see the same pattern. So we're coming off a very, very strong base. We did some work with Bill Gilmer, who runs the Regional Forecasting Institute out of the University of Houston. He was a former Fed vice president, economist, PhD. And he's done a lot of work on modeling the Houston economy and boiled it down to 3 major drivers, the big one of which is the growth of the oil and gas industry. Of course, the fact that Houston's a large city and it moves along with the U.S. economy, shown there on the left, that's a big part of it. And then a variety of pro-growth, taxation, land access, et cetera, policies also stimulate growth in Houston. But the big one that I'll focus on is the oil and gas industry. Down there at the bottom, and I mentioned in my early comments that all jobs are not created equal. The other thing that comes along with oil and gas is the multiplier effect, because those jobs tend to drive economic activity across a complex value chain. So they bring in design services, they bring in manufacturing services, construction services, et cetera. So a job like that tends to create more jobs throughout the economy. If you look at the downturn, there was a loss of those high multiplier jobs, a fairly significant loss, about 80,000. And that occurred in the 2015 to 2017 type time frame. And then just after that, we had a gain in jobs of about 87,000. So a lot of things you'll read about Houston is, hey, we're back, job growth. Job growth has taken up the losses that we had. And while that's true, the thing I want to point out is that the multiplier of the jobs we lost, which are in sectors like exploration and production, well field services and equipment, fabrication, engineering, have an average multiplier of 2.9. So effectively that means for every job in that category, it creates 2 additional jobs across the economy. If you look at the jobs that came in, they were largely in hotels, bars, healthcare, education, retail, trade, good jobs, but their multiplier effect is just over 1. So for every one of those jobs, it doesn't quite create another 3rd job in the economy. So as you can imagine, the effect on the Houston economy and that growth advantage is diminishing if we look at it now, and those lines are converging, which, just as a thought around ambition, that could be okay if we converge, but there's a question of, can we go beyond that? And when we think about going beyond that, the question is, well, can we rely just on oil and gas? So oil and gas, we think, is going to continue to be a major juggernaut in the economy. But if you project out ahead versus that 80,000 in loss, how much can we expect to make up through expansion in the oil and gas cycle? And again, we relied. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I have a question on this. Want to rudely
You can break my monologue, please.
We planned this. So what does the commodity cycle look like in these lower forever, lower for longer scenarios when EVs are cheaper and cheaper and better? What does the cycle look like?
Well, in terms of EVs in particular, the work we've done on mobility indicates that they don't explain, and gasoline derived from oil doesn't explain a significant part of oil demand. In the U.S., it's more than the rest of the world, but world overall, it's about 10%. U.S. be about 20%. But if I take your question more broadly, I think the demand destruction is embedded, right, in some of these forecasts. Fundamentally, I don't think the cycle changes. You'll still get a price signal for reinvestment when we're short on supply. The other thing that might happen in a lower demand scenario is the cost of the next available project, because we don't need as much supply, would be lower. So you're still going to have low, mid, high cycle, which these charts show. It's just a matter of what's the height of that curve.
Yeah. At those high points, because of efficiency, because of EVs, because of alternatives, do we see greater opportunity for demand destruction, more permanent demand destruction? So every time it goes up, does that destroy demand more permanently for oil?
I think there's a risk of that. You might have seen a pattern of that. I think OPEC is considering that in how they think about their supply and not over-enticing alternative competitives into the market. That might be, the driver there of that lower forever, and why that curve is at the bottom. So looking ahead, and now we're asking this question, okay, so we've got oil and gas. Oil and gas can be critical. There's some question about what level around high multiplier jobs. Good news is Houston's got some seeds in that camp, even more than seeds. We've got healthcare, manufacturing, and R&D. That's a high multiplier category. The volume isn't as high as any of the oil and gas segments. We've got a lot going on in data science and technology, and Houston Corridor and Cannon and other efforts underway to expand that. Question again is timing and extent of the jobs in that category. So the others to put on the table, but I think we'll be talking about in ensuing panels today, might include things like utility scale renewables and trading around that with RECs and carbon credits and things like that that could be in the horizon. That would be a high multiplier category. Plastics and chemicals, we have a strong presence in the early parts of the chain in commodity chemicals, but expanding further down the plastics and chemicals chain and into the circular economy and recycling aspects. That could be a very high multiplier category. Carbon sequestration and the technologies associated with capture and transportation and sequestration would also be a powerful high multiplier category. So, and there are a number of others, but I'm just putting out for instances that connect with areas that Houston might have a particular right to win, and linking that to the what else can we do in Houston beyond the traditional oil and gas industry. So final thought, KPMG did some work on how cities expand their economy and sometimes come back from a disaster, a natural disaster, say, and we looked at this with the center and the center board and looked at places like San Francisco and post the earthquake and how did they take that downturn and turn it into a significant increased presence in technology, leveraging their proximity to Silicon Valley. We looked at Denver and how they came out of the downturn and have become much more significant in energy and other technology. Just touch on the ingredients. It's about the vision, and it's about how those cities have integrated a combination of what are they trying to do with the business community, how they link that to their infrastructure and how the infrastructure supports that and attracts and retains and enables the talent needed to pull that off. So those ingredients are out there. We'll come back to that at a panel later today. Randy, over to you.
Thank you. While we're getting my slides up, just want to thank Brett for inviting me here. This is fantastic. It's so important that you're speaking about climate change here in Houston because it is, I think, ground zero for two countervailing risks from climate change. On the one hand, of course, you see extreme weather, sea level rise, et cetera. And then on the other hand, the risks from the economic risks from decarbonization, which is something that I will talk about right now. I'm going to broaden the lens a little bit to talk about the energy transition, various scenarios, and what the future might look like. Up on this slide, you'll see a list of the various scenarios that are out there for energy transition. This is just a selected list. There's many more where this comes from. And you'll note that there are, I'm particularly focused on a peak in oil demand. And you'll see that there are some that are ambitious and say that the peak in oil demand will happen next year. The Atlantic Council put together a scenario that I'll get into in a little bit that projects it in 2022. And then you see OPEC or the Institute for Energy Economics Japan or ExxonMobil's World Energy Outlook saying that there's no peak, at least through 2040. And that is a huge amount of uncertainty in terms of what will happen with oil demand and therefore, in some ways, Houston's economy. So just a bit of context when we're thinking through this.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
With a range that broad,
yeah.
How do we draw meaning out of this for the industry, for Houston? How do you think about that?
Right. So the future is, I think, when I look at this slide, I think that the future is really uncertain, and that we, in general, have to respond to uncertainty. But Houston in particular, and we'll get into why in a little bit, but you've already started touching on it, has an opportunity not just to respond, but to lead and actually shape the future. Other parts of the world, other places that are affected by sea level rise are going to just be responding. They don't have the energy industry, they don't have the ecosystem here to actually shape the future going forward, whether that is through renewables and utility scale renewables, energy trading, or carbon capture. That's just not in the cards for a number of places. And so I think that Houston really, this is why this conference is so important, can really start to think about what role it plays in shaping the energy transition. Mm-hmm. So We don't have a ton of time, but I want to just talk a little bit about some of the different drivers that are assumed in each of these scenarios, because ultimately these scenarios aren't predictions in a firm way about what is going to happen, but is what could happen if a certain number of actions are taken. And so you see that we have 2 IEA scenarios and 2 IEEJ scenarios, and BP has a number of different scenarios they put out there with a range of different assumptions. And if X happens, then the energy transition happens faster. If Y happens, it happens slower. And so the key assumptions often involve electrification of transport, energy efficiency. In Shell's scenario, I think it's very interesting. They have reforestation as an assumption, as there are incredible amounts of reforestation at the size of the country of Brazil, plus a net zero deforestation. That's in order to meet the CO2 goals. And so these drivers are all choices that we have to make. I'm going to go to our next slide, and one of the things that we've been working on is the policy drivers for electrification of transport. And so we put them in 4 buckets. So efficiency mandates like CAFE standards, low carbon fuels, so mixing in low carbon biofuel, focusing on lower carbon footprint oil. So there's a range of life cycle carbon footprints depending on where the oil is from. Saudi Arabia has some of the lowest. Then replacing internal combustion engines through electric vehicles, and then what we're calling social engineering, which is smart cities, bike lanes, all the efforts that cities and municipalities and counties and states can make to change the transportation system and destroy demand. Now, EVs are what gets talked about a lot. It's, as you say, it's harder to decarbonize heavy transport, even harder to decarbonize aviation and maritime. But both the aviation industry and the maritime industry have policy goals to decarbonize. Let me just go to my card so I don't get it wrong, what the exact numbers are. So the IMO wants to have a 50% cut in shipping greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 compared to 2008. That's going to be really hard with fossil fuels, with traditional bunker fuels. There's a potential switch to LNG. That's about 20% CO2 reduction. So we're talking about biofuels. We're talking about incredible efficiency gains. And people are talking about, in some shipping lanes, nuclear, for instance. You have to have that. There are geopolitical questions there, of course. And then the ICAO, they have a 2016 program to achieve carbon neutral growth beyond a 2020 baseline. And so they're opting this in. They're starting this very, very soon. We've been working with some of the airlines on biofuels and getting biofuels into the jet fuel mix. Etihad has a pilot project in the UAE that is really interesting. LAX has a great biofuel program with a number of different providers, and BP is playing a significant role in that. But if we talk about those scenarios and we look at some of the more aggressive peak demand scenarios, we've been doing work on what the implications of those scenarios are, both economic and geopolitical. And so we have, I have two graphs here of what we project the economic implications are, the winners and the losers from a peak in oil demand. With all those slides, all those scenarios, they project what oil demand will be, but they don't actually talk through the economics of that. IEEJ did a great study, and then our model is really designed to look at economic and geopolitical implications of the various scenarios. So what you see here is kind of what you would expect. If there is a peak in oil demand, you see importers gaining, and you see exporters losing. Saudi Arabia has, in our model, a 7.5% loss of GDP compared to the base case. And so their GDP is down 7.5% in 2040 as compared to what it would be if there was no peak in oil demand. UAE is doing a little less badly, and their economy is more diversified. We'll get into that in a little bit.
was just going to ask you, Randy, I notice a lot of the bars kind of overlay very nicely. The U.S. is kind of interesting in that one goes negative, one goes positive. Do you have a comment on that? And can you even double click on what Houston might look like on that, or Texas? Or
Well, we can talk about Texas in the next slide.
Okay.
There's been some really interesting work by the Dallas Fed on the Texas economy and diversification of the Texas economy, and a concept they call connectedness, which I really don't like that word, but it does explain what they're talking about, which is the way in which the oil and gas industry is connected to the rest of the economy. And so in 2014, as prices began to collapse, there were dire predictions that the Texas economy would go into a recession like in the 1980s. That didn't happen. GDP did drop, but the Texas economy as a whole didn't go into a recession. So you see in the graph on the right from the Dallas Fed, whenever there was an oil price drop, up until 2014, Texas went into a recession. The Texas economy as a whole has become less connected overall to the oil and gas industry and more connected to the U.S. economy. The U.S. economy is really the big driver of the Texas economy. Now you see in the chart on the left, two Gulf countries and oil price. Now, UAE likes to talk about how their economy is very diversified, and it is. 70% of their revenue is from their non-oil sectors. However, and Christoph Ruhl, the former BP chief economist, has pointed this out, that as the oil price changes, their non-oil GDP changes as well, and it tracks almost perfectly with that. And so it's heavily connected to, their non-oil GDP is heavily connected to their oil GDP. And I think sort of an easy way to think of this is comparing Etihad Airlines and Emirates Airlines. So when the oil price dropped in 2014, Etihad did far worse than Emirates. Now, both are in the UAE. Emirates Airline is really a global airline that uses Dubai as a hub, where Etihad does that a little bit, but really was focused, so much of their business was driven by the oil and gas industry. So while Etihad wouldn't count as oil and gas GDP in their official accounting, it still went down because they no longer were having oil executives fly over, and they've actually canceled their Dallas flight. So this is the question is, how does the Houston economy compare? Is it closer to the Texas economy overall, so more resilient against oil price shocks, or is it closer to, say, the UAE?
So that's a fair turnabout on the question. Well, first of all, you may recall, as I mentioned, the drivers of the Houston economy. We're inherently diversified because we're a large city and part of the part of the U.S. economy. Mm-hmm. So we have a presence in airlines, healthcare, food distribution, a number of other entities. So we'll rise and fall with the U.S. economy. So that's about a third. So we're inherently diversified. The other thing that happened in Houston back in the 80s, real estate and financial activities, which are also a big part, did diversify away from oil and gas. But that being said, there's a nuance there between diversification and therefore our risk to oil downside and growth and differentiated growth versus the rest of the economy. So back to the ambition for Houston, we could be okay just to track back to following the U.S. economy, which is the path we're more or less headed on now. The question is, should we take advantage of some of the trends that we'll explore further to create some industries with the scale potential and the multiplier potential to continue that advantage trend line?
Right. So one of the things, as we're talking about diversification, we think about what choices that Houston can make, but what the companies that are working in Houston can make. And I think this chart, we published this in January 2019. One of the great things about my job is that there are a whole bunch of smart people working with me, so I borrow from their work all the time. So a lot of this other work has been borrowed from people as well. This is from my colleague David Karani. And you see the range of different types of investments that energy companies are making. Now, in any of these peak oil demand scenarios, there's going to be oil demand out to 2050 at least, and you're talking 40, 50, 60 million barrels a day, depending on who's guessing. And so you will see, the oil and gas industry in Houston will not go away. If the prices continue to go down, the rents that the oil and gas industry will be able to extract are lower. And so you think about what can these industries do in order to really be the dynamic companies that they continue to be the dynamic companies that they are today. And this chart just lists a few of the really interesting investments that are happening. The one that I think is the biggest bet, perhaps maybe too big of a bet, is what E&I has done investing in fusion. And they put $50 million into an MIT spin-out working on fusion. But there's a range of types of investments, from carbon capture to solar to storage. Occidental's not on this chart, but what they're doing with net power and their goals to be carbon neutral, it's incredibly impressive. And so really thinking out ahead, what does the world look like in 2050? We don't know, but Houston has an opportunity to really shape what that world looks like, as I said at the beginning.
Can I ask you a quick, pull maybe another thread of Houston through this? So if I think about the Houston area, we have two different types of challenges. One, we're a coastal community.
Yep.
And as we saw through Storm Harvey, there was a chemical release in the chemical plants, so we know about it. Refining industry did well, real well, but some shutdowns coming out. So we have the exposure to sea level changes, et cetera. And then the economic changes that you're suggesting.
Yeah.
Do you see patterns emerging in terms of how we're addressing those things? And is there kind of a win-win in there where we are leading as Houston in addressing those things?
Right. So these two countervailing risks that we discussed at the beginning, assuming there is an energy transition, but if it takes a long time, Houston is going to be probably more exposed to sea level rise and to extreme weather. If it's a much faster transition, that risk, the risk from climate change, is likely diminished. However, the economic risks are greater. Now, if you look at policy as one of the major drivers of this transition, and anyone who's following the Democratic primary will see that is, if a Democrat wins, it will be a major issue come 2021. And policy will play a major role in the energy space, again, in the US, decarbonization policy. And globally, we see that as well. If that happens, Houston can either respond or lead. And as I said, Houston has an opportunity to lead. And so there's a number of different things that Houston can do. And Houston as a city is already doing some very good things, encouraging decarbonization of buildings, encouraging electric vehicles, bike lanes, the social engineering piece that we discussed. And then there are other opportunities. Petrochemicals are hugely interesting, petrochemicals and plastics. As GDP grows, petrochemical and plastic growth tracks right alongside that. There is a risk with single-use plastics and the movement against single-use plastics. And so the energy industry is starting to get ahead of that and realize that this is something that is a risk to this long-term growth and really isn't a necessary component and actually should be playing a greater, plastics should be playing a greater role in the energy transition by making lightweight materials. There was a statistic from the AFPM the other day. It's plastic components are 50% of a car, but 10% of their weight. And so that's really part of energy efficiency. That's really part of making the future of transportation possible. It's part of making aviation more efficient, for instance. Mm-hmm. And so getting ahead of that and really playing a role in that, I think, is crucial.
Okay. We have about 20 seconds left, so maybe last question to you. Any patterns you see emerging? What excites you about what some of Houston's leading companies, or you touched a little bit on the broader Houston constituencies, but what would you observe?
So first of all, the European companies tend to be a little more forward-leaning in this. So there was a study late last year that suggested that it was Shell, Total, and Repsol with the most ambitious low-carbon diversification efforts. Though I'm not sure if Oxy is probably right up there. But I think the good thing is that these companies all have huge presences here in Houston, and I hope and you're starting to see movement in the U.S. companies as well, and I hope that we can continue to push them in that direction.
Excellent. So we have opportunities to lead from an adaptation standpoint, from a mitigation standpoint. Our leading companies are on the move. There are other Houston constituents on the move. We have the opportunity to grab some prizes out of that.
Yeah.
But we have to be very conscious of the risks underlying this as well. So thank you all.